philosophy should be required, I would like it to be by law, to have to take this oath. And I'd like the International Academic Union, the World Association of Universities, to take this up. All the Catholic universities in the world and so on could embed this Pythagorean oath, as I call it, into their graduation for higher doctorates. When I was given my PhD by the University of London, it was a very moving day. Obviously, I'd worked for this for years, and I wouldn't have minded swearing this thing. I mean, it's part of the theatre, but actually it's really important. I mean, I swore it mentally because I'm a philosopher and I believe in ethics, but what I'm shocked at is how many scientists are misusing their knowledge who haven't sworn this in an oath. So anyway, there we are. It's there, Peace Declaration. So it's been very exciting working on this project, and but what frightens me and worries me is how many scientists have throughout history misused their knowledge. It's not just the Nazi doctors peddling a sort of pseudo-racist ideology. That was based on a misreading of Darwinism by people like Ernst Haeckel, a German philosopher of science. And they really did believe in a sort of hierarchy of races. So the white race is the supreme, best race. Then there are these other types, and then there are the Semites, and then there are the Jews, and then there are the black races. And so the white races had this sort of right to go and colonize, conquer, and enslave these lesser races. And it became a justification for the geopolitics of colonialism and racism over the centuries. I've also been studying the way this was not only in Germany and in Britain to some extent, although in Britain we fought back and the liberal intellectuals of Britain opposed these racist ideas and opposed the ideology that buttressed slavery and so on, which was also based on a misreading of biblical texts, because these racist people reading the Bible hadn't got a clue what the Bible actually means. They'd never studied the Kabbalah, the inner esoteric meaning of these texts. They hadn't been initiated into the universal meaning of the Bible, the true, deeper sense of the meaning of, the stories of Moses, Abraham, and so on. But so the British liberal intellectuals had resisted and fought back against this petty racism. But it was a hard-won battle, and still today, I watch on my television screen with horror as English racists are chanting, their own slogans, their own battle cries, as if reaffirming Englishness has anything to do with that kind of racist attitude. And in America too, a lot of scientists were, so-called scientists, pseudoscientists, were misusing their knowledge, their smatterings of knowledge, to argue this neo-Darwinian evolutionary model whereby, there was this hierarchy of the races, which ultimately leads to white Americans having they've inherited all the good things on Earth. And therefore that justified slavery in America, it justified cheating the ethnic minorities of America out of the vote. It justified the genocide against the American Indian. And there's some very chilling documentaries available on YouTube about all this, which I recommend people to watch. But really it's time for a reckoning here, If my system was in place, these people wouldn't have gotten away with that. I've always been a fan of A.R. Wallace, in that I've always found his humility compared to Darwin's dogmatism more satisfying intellectually. Wallace was the co-discoverer of the theory of natural selection, but he kept ethics in, he kept spirituality in. And I ended up head of Poole Grammar School Philosophy and Religious Studies Department, next door to where he's buried. We had a couple of lectures in his honour. A.R. Wallace was a humbler man, and therefore he had the courage to say, I don't know, but I still have some kind of faith. I'm not going to throw out all all the accumulated faith of all the spiritual heritage of all humanity, just because, you know, I thought of a clever idea, natural selection. Whereas Darwin didn't have that faith. He didn't have that humility. And although his wife was a strong Christian, he didn't. I mean, he was a funny chap, temperamentally. I've been to Down House, you know. I know, I've met, I mean, my ex-partner was a relative of Charles Darwin, so, you know, I've met the Darwin, you know, tradition. And I used to lecture in Shrewsbury, where we had the Darwin Festival, and I created a Wallace Festival in kind of complementary, not exactly opposition, but, you know, hey, don't forget the spiritual dimension type of gesture. And I was training as a religious studies teacher at the time, so look up A.R. Wallace if you don't know about him. And if you see, if we'd have gone down the Wallace route, the Nazi stuff would never have happened. They couldn't have got away with it, because ethics would have been left in the picture. Nor would the Soviet misuse of Darwinianism have been possible. There was you know, an appropriation of Darwinian ideas also going on in some elements of Soviet science and Chinese Maoist. You know, this simplistic idea of class struggle being inevitable, and it was, you know, a race to the finish, and everyone, you know, the good people had to win, the bad people had to die. That's the kind of extremism that I oppose as a philosopher, as a philosopher of peace and non-violence. We have to rethink the ideologies that led us to these wars, World War II, the Cold War, and so on. And we have to trace it all the way back. And if we can take it back to a rethinking of what science is just knowledge. It just means knowledge in Italian, right? Knowledge is never finished. There's no such thing as final knowledge. Nobody has that. I mean, Newton, one of the wisest people at the time, he said, all of my life I've just been tossing pebbles into the ocean. He knew the more you know, the more you realise how vast the ocean of knowledge is. I mean, dear old Dalai Lama is a pretty clever chap. I mean, he knows a lot in his lineage of, you know, his particular school of Buddhism and related fields. He's looked at science and so on. And his name means ocean of wisdom. But the true ocean of wisdom is like a million billion Dalai Lamas worth times, you know, a trillion. I mean, it's vast. And so each of us, you might be the most omniscient Buddha manifesting on the planet at the moment, but your knowledge is going to be minuscule in comparison to the potential enormity of true knowledge. I mean, listen to Rupert Sheldrake talking about Is the Sun Conscious? It's a great lecture. Thank you, Rupert. Given recently. And it's very relevant to the time of solstice, of course, because, you know, is the sun conscious? Rupert thinks probably it is because he subscribes to this so-called heretical view of panpsychism, that the whole universe is conscious, including the suns, the stars, the galaxies, and so on. It's, you know, I've known Rupert for many years, and we've discussed such matters. And I once gave a lecture on the nature of love in his home in Hampstead with his wife Jill Peirce as well. And we have a lot in common in our philosophical approach. He's more scientific, I'm more philosophical. But what I love about Rupert is the scale of his thinking. His mind is able to reach out and ask questions like, is the sun conscious? Well, yes, of course it is. What Rupert's trying to do is design a test. How can we prove that empirically? Well, we can try and send it messages. Yeah, okay, well, that's what the Druids have been doing for centuries, and that's why they built Stonehenge, and that's why we celebrate the solstice. But so, if we change science and make it more humble, make it more infused with ethics, with spirituality, and above all with peace. I want a science of peace. I don't want these military scientists. They should be exposed for what they are, which is, you know, the evil genie of the planet. They should be stuck back in the bottle. And it's nothing personal. You know, I've known people that work for military many years. You know, I've known quite a few generals in my time, but I've known the ones that came out for peace eventually. And we need more generals for peace, really. And we need more military intelligence and, masters of dark internet hacking and stuff to come out for peace. Okay, so I want to mention also, therefore, there is a fight back among academics. There are some brilliant minds out there. I've just come across a wonderful professor at Emory University, Carol Anderson, who has given a brilliant lecture on, it was a special lecture at her university, really on what it's like to be black in America today. Most people in the West, most white Americans, most white Europeans and so on, haven't got a clue what it must actually be like to be, a person of colour in the States. And it's her lecture is the single best hour I think I've ever spent to really understand it from within. She was talking 2 years ago, even before the current crisis, when the Ferguson riots were going on and flames and everything. You remember that? We have such a short-term memory now because we're all so plugged into social media that we're just, riding the next wave that's coming along. So now it's George Floyd, and in 6 months' time it'll be something else. Well, this amazing woman, Carol, she remembers all that stuff. She clocks it. She studies it, and salutations to her work, because she's able to make it come alive for all of us. And she talks about the way the black community in the States have been disenfranchised for centuries. And although slavery was ended by Lincoln, the instruments and the forms of thinking that are led to it remained in people's minds. So there was this sense by the white community that lost the war, the Confederates and so on, that, well, hey, we were robbed. We are entitled to dominate the black people. And so they invented new ways of doing that, both overtly using violence by inventing things like the Ku Klux Klan, which then did lynchings and so on, and terrorism, but then also subtly by infiltrating the polling system. So although all the blacks now had a vote, and Carol explains how it's done. I mean, you must watch this film. In large parts of America, still today, 2018, 2020, there are subtle ways of disenfranchising black voters. So, for instance, she gives one example. I think it's a poor part of, Florida, a precinct with lots of, I think it was Florida, lots of, poor African Americans, because, in aggregate, sociologically speaking, they belong to the lower classes, the working classes, and unemployed. So they're living in public housing. And the law says that you need now voter ID with a photograph, officially government issued. And there are various things like driver's license, whatever. Now, in that area, they say no, but you can't have the ID that you're given for effectively your council house, which has a photo on, is government issued. But by making it not acceptable for the voter registration thing, it was found to be a way of disenfranchising a whole community, because they couldn't afford to drive, they may not have a license. It might have been in Texas this was done, I can't remember, you have to listen to the talk, because the same lot made it legal if you had a gun license. So you have photo ID to have a gun, your gun license, that's acceptable. And that implies that you're kind of wealthy enough to do shooting as a sport, to own guns, you're probably from a white community. Whereas if you're poor and you have just a housing ID, that's not acceptable. So what Carol does, and it's so important to lecture now, is unpick the way that systemic racism is still targeting the poor and the unfranchised and the black communities of America now. And of course it's been given this huge filibuster by Trump and Trumpism, who stood on that ticket. and was swept into power by the systematic whipping up of white racial hatred, and by Steve Bannon and his deliberate targeting of these groups feeling, we the whites have been oppressed, we're going to fight back. And Chris Wiley explains how that was done. I mean, technically, but also politically and sociologically. Chris Wiley's book, Mind F***CK, is a must read to understand how he got into the present situation. And Carol's lecture gives a brilliant exposition of what happens. She's Professor of African American Studies. Also in the book of Peace Declarations, I give some information about Africa, because not many people realise, but Africa as a whole has declared itself nuclear weapons free. There was a treaty signed in South Africa after Mandela was released from prison and apartheid ended. South Africa chose a non-nuclear weapons future. Libya chose around that time, and Gaddafi and Mandela were in contact. And they organised a treaty signing, which I give the text in full, saying that no African country will ever develop nuclear weapons. This is such an important thing, and I 100% support that, of course. And also, in the book, is what's called the Yamssoukro Declaration, which was a conference on peace in the minds of men in 1989. And this was a very historic conference, which I've known about all these years, and I made the effort to find the text and discover about it. And it took place in 1989 at a place called Yamssoukro, hosted by the La Fondation Félix Houphouët-Boigny pour la recherche de la paix. It's a francophone country, Ivory Coast, and this amazing man, Houphouët-Boigny, was the president of Ivory Coast for many years, and he was an intellectual, he was a francophone, he spoke fluent French. He was actually from a native African, pagan tribal culture originally. He also was baptized as Roman Catholic. His name means the sage, or the prophet, Dia, in his native language. Anyway, he became a great ruler, and what I didn't realise is he founded this amazing peace research institute, which, if you look at it on the internet, I mean, it's huge. I mean, it's wonderful, because he knew how important peace is. And in this Yamssoukro Declaration, I'll read a couple of bits. It says, peace is reverence for life. Peace is the most precious possession of humanity. Peace is more than the end of armed conflict. Peace is a mode of behaviour. Peace is a deep-rooted commitment to the principles of liberty, justice, equality, and solidarity among all human beings. Peace is also a harmonious partnership of humanity with the environment. And so on. I mean, it goes on. It's a very moving declaration, and peace does begin in the minds of men. Dans l'esprit des hommes in French. It's l'esprit, in the spirit of men. In English, we distinguish between the spirit and the mind. Well, actually, it's l'esprit des hommes. So that's some of the African inclusions. And I find Africa such a precious thing for humanity to embrace, and I'd love to see a European nuclear-free zone declaration. I'm going to work tirelessly for the rest of my life that Europe can catch up with Africa and with Latin America, who both declared themselves nuclear weapon-free zones. I'd like to appeal to all the anti-nuclear campaigners in Europe, whether in France or the UK or Scotland or wherever. Let's come together and get a nuclear-free zone for the whole of Europe. Ukraine has declared itself nuclear weapons free. Let the whole of Europe, including Russia, now, big scary, thing. Yeah, okay, but America has to do the same. America has to, I mean the USA, has to join the Treaty of Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone of Latin America, which includes Mexico on south, all the way down to the tip of Argentina and Chile. I want to see in my lifetime all these nuclear weapons gone, because they're an abomination to humanity. The destructive power. I was involved in an online conference on nuclear weapons during this lockdown with people all over the planet, who included Hibakusha, survivors of the original Hiroshima and Nagasaki blasts. And, the destructive power of these weapons is apocalyptically, mind-bogglingly unacceptable. And dear old Einstein knew that, which is why he campaigned for so many years to get rid of them. And he thought they were too big and powerful to be in any one government's hand, not the USA. Which brings me to, yes, the question of Roosevelt and why he died and the tragedy of that. Because I think if Roosevelt had lived, I don't know that nuclear weapons would have been dropped as they were by Truman on Japan. It's a complex what if of history. What I do think is that the future of the world would have been better. I don't think there would have been this huge Cold War kicked off in the same way. Roosevelt knew the costs of war, and what I've discovered in the last week since I was researching, I watched a brilliant film by Michael Moore, who's a filmmaker I greatly respect, and his film Capitalism, which is absolutely worth watching. And it gives, in the last sequence, a speech by Roosevelt that he made just before he died. And he said to the American people that he wanted to bequeath them a second Bill of Rights. The first Bill of Rights was the normal Bill of Rights that Americans have, which guarantees things like freedom of speech and all that stuff. Liberal rights. The second one was to give them the right to education, the right to health, the right to a home, the right to a job, like social rights, social and economic rights. And this was visionary stuff coming from Roosevelt in 1944. Now, had he lived and implemented that, these racial and economic disparities that you get in the US, I don't think would have happened. Roosevelt was a committed Democrat who believed in egalitarianism as a democratic principle. Now, it doesn't mean that, that some people aren't going to get further ahead, but you start off with a level playing field which is higher up than the abject, rock bottom that we've sunk to now. So, yeah, this second Bill of Rights, I think, was incredibly important. And actually, that's what we're guaranteed under the European Union. They have a Bill of Rights, social rights, a declaration made in 2000, guaranteeing rights to, things like unemployment help and social security and health and all that. We don't have that in the UK, and I think it's outrageous that the UK is being pulled out of the European Union under this umbrella, this satanic conspiracy by the Cambridge Analytica, Steve Bannon and co, American intelligence operatives working for the hard right, the shadow state, and they've been beavering away ever since they killed Kennedy, in my opinion. These are, where was our British intelligence standing up to these guys? They've fostered this climate of racial hatred, both in the UK and America, and they should be exposed. They're criminal conspirators, and the British Parliament should stand up against them. They should have forcibly brought Dominic Cummings, this mad rogue Dracula character, they should have forcibly brought him to Parliament to answer charges about his manipulation of data illegally during the Brexit referendum. Parliament lacked teeth. They had the right to actually put him in prison, and should have done so. If I'd have been an MP, I would have not hesitated, because the evidence in the book Mind F***CK is 100% damning. Listen to Chris Wiley, and review his evidence for the way the extreme right hijacked British democracy. Well, it's never too late to stand up for truth and justice against that blatant manipulation. And if we in Britain are going to weather this ridiculous storm, we have to analyse where it's come from. We know it came from racist, right-wing, white supremacists from America hijacking British democracy, really colonising Britain for their own interests, with support by some other dodgy characters, because they're, but that was the core of it, I believe. And that's a tragedy. That's a tragedy for America. It's also a tragedy for Britain, because my country is better than that. And I want to share a little something next about a friend of mine, Harlow Shapley, who was professor of astronomy at Harvard and a friend of Roosevelt. And his son, Carl Shapley, was a great friend of mine, who founded the New World Academy. And he was prepared to talk to the Russians immediately after World War II. He said we should have like an intellectual diplomacy. It was Harlow Shapley, who was an astronomer who discovered the Galactic Centre, that put the S into UNESCO. He was there at the declaration of UNESCO. He helped write some of the articles, because he believed, like I do passionately, that academics, intellectuals and scientists, we have a duty to collaborate internationally for peace. And Harlow Shapley was then, his son Carl carried that work on forward, and I met him. Carl always used to talk about, as a boy, remembering Einstein coming round to talk and play the violin. He was a family friend. He was at Princeton. And it's fascinating to think that the visions of that era, 1948, 47, 46, when people thought we could have peace on the planet. I still won't give up on that dream. Harlow Shapley organised a big conference in New York for peace, and Shostakovich went, first time that a Russian composer had been, of Shostakovich's standards. So I've given the declarations of all this in the book. So these peace conferences were making declarations. Where I found them, I've given the text. I'm still researching a couple more, because but these were attempts by intellectuals at the end of World War II to prevent a Cold War and to enable genuine peace to be made in the minds of men, as UNESCO said. I've given the declarations that created UNESCO, obviously. And my aunt, Libby Jones, she worked in the offices developing UNESCO in Paris at the time. I talked to her about this, interviewed her, and she told me quite a lot about her time working for the foundation of UNESCO immediately after the war. She lived with my mother in London during the war, in Hampstead, and worked for naval intelligence. Libby was a very clever Welshwoman, and she got a job helping set up UNESCO in Paris and jumped at it. She then married my mother's brother, who was my Uncle Jack, and who was, they were a lovely couple. We often used to spend Christmases together as two families. I lament Libby's, she would be up in arms about how Britain has been hijacked from an intelligent country to a sort of colonised, dumbed down, annexed state to white racist Trumpites that are now marching outside the British Parliament and booing Nazi slogans. I mean, and you've got to read Chris Wiley to work out how this is done. why those people are doing that, and how they know where to assemble. It's all done through their, they're being whipped up to these pictures of hatred, targeted deliberately. If we're going to stop them, if we're going to fight back, if we're going to prevent this, we have to know how it's been done. Read the books, study. I want to share something else. This is quite interesting because one of the other things I've been researching, obviously, I'm working on a commentary on Das Kapital. My mother was a Marxist, and she was always, and that's why she was such a peace activist. I've got a declaration by Lenin in this volume 4, the famous declaration he made in 1917 when he spoke about peace. Because Lenin broke all the rules of diplomacy. Whatever you think of Lenin, he was 100% committed to peace, and he took Russia out of the war immediately, World War I. He said it was a bourgeois war, it's a capitalist war. The only people benefiting were the kind of arms dealers, the bankers, and so on. He wanted nothing to do with it, so that was it. Peace. And this was breaking all the rules. Not only that, but he also published all the secret treaties that the Russian state under the Tsar had entered into, the conspiratorial diplomatic treaties that led up to the war. And there was a lot of, skullduggery going on behind the scenes. Wars don't just come out of nowhere. There was a ganging up against Germany that had been going on between France. Russia had been playing the game. The British had been pulling the strings. 2 Scottish forensic historians have exposed the skullduggery. Well, Lenin said, look, we want a new start for humanity. We want a new openness in diplomacy. So he published all these secret treaties, which blew the whistle on the scam that these diplomats had been doing for decades, for centuries. And of course they didn't like it, so what did they do? They immediately started invading and trying to destroy his little Bolshevik-run country with invasions. He happened to have a very good assistant called Trotsky who managed to win the war and fight them off. Okay, the rest is history, but what I've given is the peace declaration that Lenin made, because I think it's important we look at these texts, we look at these source documents and study them as historians and peace scholars. What were the nuances? What were they doing? And I also have gone back to Marx, and as a Marxologist, if you want, I think it's very important we reread the Communist Manifesto, because that started the whole ball rolling. And I've given the text of the Communist Manifesto here. And in my research, I discovered, way back in my undergraduate days, the links between the communist milieu of these esoteric groups. The Communist Manifesto was written by Marx and Engels, mainly by Marx, for the League of Communists, it was called. It was based in London. It was formed from a thing called the League of the Just, which was a Christian, socialist, visionary, utopian kind of network. And that grew out of other secret societies, quasi-Masonic groups that were bubbling up all over Europe since the 18th century. These were often Freemasonic lodges devoted to science, to rationalism, to ethics, the progress of humanity. And they were very active during the decades leading up to the French Revolution, and many of the people that signed the tennis school oath in Paris were from those schools. So they were active in America. A lot of the American progressives and Republicans were from these same, Now, were they conspiratorial? Were they dark satanic things? No, they were just people trying to come together to take a stand for justice and wisdom and enlightenment. They were also very active in Russia at this time, in the 18th century.